Speaker, just a few housekeeping notes. I think all of you are pretty well versed at this time, but this session is going to be recorded and it will be shared with all registrants when it is finalized. That does take a few weeks. We do add closed captions to our recordings, so please just be patient with us. We will send it out when it is ready. Attendees will remain muted for the discussion. However, we do want this to be an interactive experience. Please put your questions in the chat function of your window at the bottom right-hand corner if you're using your computer, and direct your question to all participants. We will monitor the questions throughout the session, and the panelist, the speaker today can answer questions at the end of the presentation. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Gary Vikan. Gary is the author of the book, The Holy Shroud, A Brilliant Hoax in the Time of Black Death. Gary was the director for the Walters Art Museum from 1994 to 2013 and served as the museum's chief curator from 1984 to 1994. He was appointed by President Clinton in 1999 to his Cultural Property Advisory Committee and was knighted by the French Minister of Culture in the Order of Arts and Letters in 2002, which sounds pretty neat. I'd love to hear more about that. He is an internationally known medieval scholar and holds a PhD in medieval art. Gary, thank you so much for being here with us and for working with us through this technology issue earlier today. We are excited for your presentation.
Thank you very much. You know, I much prefer to actually open a door and walk into a room and see people's faces. I don't think I'm unusual in this, but this technology stuff is always a challenge. So thank you all very much for joining me today, and thank specifically Tracy Miller, because I can say that without her intervention, probably about a year ago or so, I would never have found an agent for this book. And so in a way, the book owes its existence to Tracy. The book came out in May, and it's not the greatest time to have a book tour, but thank you very much, because I enjoy talking about the Shroud. It's been a preoccupation of mine, or at least an avocation of mine, since the early 1980s. And as I say, only in retirement was able finally to get this where I wanted to be. So next slide, please. Just to be clear on what we're talking about, the Shroud of Turin is a piece of linen 14 feet long, a little over 3 feet wide, that has printed on it in very faint sepia tones, just kind of faint rusty looking tones, what appears to be the body of a bearded, long-haired man with a mustache, printed front and back, more or less as you can imagine it from the picture at the upper right in this slide. He is seemingly just having come down from the cross after the crucifixion, and he seems to bear all kinds of bloody wounds. You can see, if you look very closely, there seems to be a bloody wound in his right upper wrist. There seems to be a lot of whipping marks on his back. Rivulets of blood seem to come down from his forehead. If you were to kind of reverse engineer this image into a real human being that could stand up and walk, he would be about 5'11", quite a big man, and perhaps 170 or 80 pounds. The Shroud of Turin is kept in a tiny but elegantly beautiful chapel at the back of the Cathedral of St. John in Turin, Italy. And it's kept in a very elaborate precious metal reliquary, a box, and comes out only occasionally. It was out in 2015, 2010, and will be out again in 2025. When it comes out, it usually is displayed only in the church, only for about 6 or 8 weeks. In that time, up to 50,000 people walk past this textile every day. So that will add up to something in excess of 2, perhaps 3 million people will see it when it's on display. It now belongs to the Vatican. It belongs to the Catholic Church, but this has only been true since 1983. Before that time, it belonged to an Italian-French royal family of Savoy, the Duchy of Savoy. And given that Turin is the capital of that duchy, that is where the shroud ended up. It's been in that church since the late 16th century. Before that time, it wandered around France for a while, and you can trace its history back, and I'll do this in some detail later on. You can trace its history back, its paper trail, in fact, from today back to about 1355 to the mid-14th century, and I'll get to that later. Next image, please. So you can either think of the shroud in two different ways. And when 2 million people, 3 million people see it over a course of 8 weeks or so, most of them are seeing it as the image of the dead Christ. Most of them take it to be a miraculous image. And for them, I cheer them on, and that's fine. I take it to be an artifact, something made by a human being. And as an artifact, this object, in my view, has to conform to the rules of history, to the rules of art history, and to the rules of science. And so over the years, I've kind of tracked each of these paths down, and I find they all converge in the same place. So for me, the story of the shroud is the story of behaving by the rules of history, art history, and science. So I'm going to walk through these rules a little bit, and I think you'll learn something that may surprise you as I do. Next slide, please. Relics. If you read the Gospels, the story of Christ is recorded by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is almost no mention whatsoever of relics as we now understand them in Christianity. In other words, the Holy Cross, the Holy Nails, the crown of thorns, the Holy Crib of Jesus as a baby, these things which became so important in the Middle Ages were not talked about by the evangelists. In fact, it wasn't until the 4th century, the early 4th century, that relics entered Christian life, belief, and ritual. And let me be clear, by relics, I mean the whole or part of a body of a holy person, a saint, or something that holy person, a saint, Jesus, the Virgin Mary, had touched. So among the very earliest relics in Christianity, you see on the left, and it's the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem. It was uncovered in landfill beneath the Roman temple in about 325 AD. In other words, almost exactly 300 years after the historical Jesus. And it was discovered by the mother of the first Christian Roman emperor, St. Helen. His name was Constantine the Great. And it's a sacred place because it includes a marble slab that the faithful believe Jesus was laid upon when he came down from the cross. So it's a relic by virtue of having touched the body of Jesus, and it's been a relic that has been venerated. Pilgrims has visited it piously for now 1700 years. But what I'm saying by this is that before around 300, relics did not exist in Christian life. After 300, they proliferated, such that there are now tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of relics around the Christian world. So if you were to date the shroud as a relic, as something you believe to have touched the body of Jesus, it begins to fit into Christian life only beginning around the year 300. But in fact, it's not simply a relic. It's a relic with an image. And these are a special subcategory of relics that are really quite famous in Christianity. And they, for example, there is something called the Veronica veil. And the belief there is that when Jesus was walking up to Calvary with the cross on his shoulder, he stumbled. And a woman named Veronica stepped forward from the crowd and pressed a cloth against his face. And that cloth miraculously retained his image. So it is an image miraculously made, but it's also a relic because it's touched the face of Jesus. So that category of relic that bears a miraculous image appears in Christianity for the first time around 600 AD. And obviously the Shroud of Turin, as an artifact, in my perspective, is a relic, seemingly a relic for having touched the body of Jesus, but it is also a miraculous image that is retained after that contact. So by my dating criteria, as in the history of relics, it is not datable before around AD 600. Next slide. So for most people, what I'm about to say is a big surprise. There are no images of Jesus before around 300. In other words, when relics entered Christian life, it's almost exactly within a generation, the same time that we have the first images of Jesus. So 300 years go by after the crucifixion before anybody makes a portrait of Jesus, an image of Jesus. And that surprises people. And by the way, there is no description of Jesus in the Gospels. Interestingly enough, the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus is known. We know what he looks like because he's on the coins, but we don't know what Jesus looks like. So that when he's finally portrayed around 300 years after Christ, after the crucifixion, he's portrayed as a quality that he has. For example, he's a dynamic healer. So he looks a little like Dionysus or Apollo, a Roman god who's powerful, dynamic, and young. Or he may be Christ in wisdom, in which case he'll look like Zeus. So they're not even attempts at real portraiture, but rather capturing in physical form a quality that they associate with Christ, dynamic healer or wise holy man. The crucifixion is shown in art only 150 years later. What you see on the left in this slide is the first known image of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, two things are kind of striking, or three things are striking. First, that 450 years have gone by since the event before anybody portrays the event. Secondarily, if you look closely, his eyes are open. And third, you can see that his arms are straight out. And if you didn't look really closely and see that there are nails in the palms of his hands, he just looks like he's standing with his arms out. Now, another 250 years go by before his head tilts. Now, this may sound a little odd, but it's true. Christians were very reluctant, first of all, to show Christ in physical form, and then very reluctant to show him suffering, to show him humiliated. Crucifixion was a brutal form of capital punishment and a humiliating public form of capital punishment. So that Christians were very uncomfortable showing Christ dead on the cross. And finally, around 700 AD, you see him dead on the cross and you see a little bit of blood flowing from his side. So then another, 400 years almost go by before he is shown on the ground after the crucifixion. And obviously this is a significant date because the Shroud of Turin shows Jesus printed on a textile as if on the ground after the crucifixion. So what I'm saying is it's more than 1,000 years after Christ before Christian artists for the first time showed Jesus lying out on the ground. Next slide, please. But the final step, and remember that the image of the man in the shroud, who you're now seeing here on the right in a negative, and if you look closely, you can see on his proper right hand a bright mark, bright blob, and that's seeming blood flow. You can see seeming flagellation wounds on his chest. You can see what seems to be a bloody wound coming out of his right side. You can see what seem to be droplets of blood on his forehead, presumably coming from the poking of the crown of thorns. So what I'm saying is that bloody, humiliated on the ground version of Christ, that blood quality of it does not appear in Christian art till the 14th century. And you see on the left-hand side a brutal image of the dead Christ lying in his mother's lap after the crucifixion. And he's just absolutely torn apart. And in art history, they call this a kind of blood frenzy, and realize that blood in Christian art does not appear and is not talked about until almost 14 centuries after the crucifixion of Christ. So by all these criteria, the Shroud of Turin wants to find its tone historically as a relic and as an image of the brutally crucified Christ. It comes to rest in the 14th century. Next image. What's interesting about the moment that it comes to rest in is that it exactly coincides with the Black Death. The Black Death, by the way, is a bacterial pandemic, unlike a virus, which we now experience. And its mortality rate is anywhere from 30 to 90%. It entered Europe from Crimea by way of some ships that landed at the port of Messina in Sicily in the fall of 1473. By that summer, 50,000 people had died from the plague in Paris. By that fall, half the population of the town of Avignon in south of France, where the Pope then had his residence, were dead. People believed that you got it by looking at one another. The mortality rate was so high, and the speed by which the victim died was so amazingly fast that nobody knew what to do about it. There were not enough priests to conduct last rites. There were not enough grave diggers to bury the dead. On the left in that image, you can see somebody wrapped in a shroud being buried. And if you look very close, you can see that a victim who's attended the funeral and standing right next to the decedent is actually being attacked at that moment, because the symptoms of the plague were hugely enlarged lymph nodes, either in your neck, your armpits, or your groin. And they were so painful and so immediate that you would just fall down within a matter of hours from the first time that you were struck. And there are stories of pigs that would nose around in corpses of the deceased and walk away and fall over dead in an instant. And in Avignon itself, as you may know, it's on the Rhone River, and it has that famous bridge that's part of that song. In Avignon, the Pope lived, and they dug trenches for the dead. And they couldn't keep up with it, and they couldn't cover the trenches fast enough. So finally, the Pope consecrated the Rhone River so that the bodies could be tossed over that bridge and float out to the Mediterranean. That's how bad it was. And people didn't know what to make of it. And on the right, you see an image of what are called flagellants. These are people who formed small societies, small groups, both men and women, and they would walk from town to town whipping themselves. They would strip, as you can see, to the waist, and they'd have whips, much like Roman whips, and they would whip their backs, and they would whip the backs of one another, and they would often put white sheets over their head. So you can imagine, in my view, an artist, an artisan, looking out his window in 1350. Half the people in his town have died. He can see people walking into town, whipping themselves. They had to be instructed not to whip themselves to death. That's how severe it was. And so blood was everywhere. And what you see at the bottom center of this slide is actually a wealthy person's tomb. And he's showing himself on his tomb in statuary as a body decaying in death. So just to roll the tape back slightly, what I'm saying is that by iconography of Jesus, by the blood frenzy that I discussed, by the history of relics, the shroud comes to rest exactly at a point in the history of Western Europe when death is paramount, when it is part of people's lives, and where everyday people are visible in the tiny squares of your town, whipping themselves almost to death. So as you think now of the shroud, which seems to be the image of a dead man bearing the marks of being whipped brutally, you can see the connection between the moment in real people's lives and the image that's captured on that linen textile. Next image, please. So now, starting from the other direction, everything I've talked about up to this point has begun with the historical Jesus and moving forward. And the evidence that I brought to bear, namely relics, iconography, blood frenzy, Black Death, brings us up to the mid 14th century. Now I start actually in Turin and follow the paper trail of the shroud as it's known in the historical record. And it's actually over the last 600 years and change belonged to two aristocratic families only. It's never been owned by the church until 1983. The House of Savoy has owned it since the mid 15th century, and before that, it belonged to the family of the most famous knight of the Middle Ages. His name was Geoffroy de Charny, and he wrote the book of chivalry. And his fame grew as he was the most famous knight in the 100 Years' War, leading the French and acting on behalf of King John II, as he was in constant warfare, and his successor was as well, over nearly 100 years with the English. And this textile was given as a gift to this knight who wrote the book of chivalry around 1355. He died 1 year later, carrying the French battle standard in the Battle of Poitiers, right next to the king. He saved the king's life. The king, John II, was captured and taken as a prisoner to England. But in the meantime, his most famous knight and dearest friend, Geoffroy de Charny, went down with a blow from a lance and died in Poitiers. So he died in 1356. The shroud was given to him as a gift in 1355, and we know its history almost continuously from that point forward. We don't know its history before 1355, and it's my contention that that's almost exactly the year it was made. Now, what did he do with that once it was given to him? He put it in his little church. Collegiate church. And it's so named because it had a small college of prelates, of priests, who were employed in that church. And this church that was built by Geoffroy de Charny in the early 1350s, was initially made of wood. Now it was replaced in the 19th century, on the upper left here in this slide, by a church in stone. But originally it was wood and quite small. And the town of Lirey in northeast France, it's about an hour and a half by train southeast of Paris, teeny little town, still has 100 people, never had more than 100 people. He built this church and employed 7 prelates in this church, a dean and 6 collegiates, to pray for him and his family 24/7, 365. That was their job, to pray for him and his family. And because he was so close to the King of France, and because he was also close to the Pope in Avignon, Clement VI, both of them wanted to make sure that he had, because he wasn't hugely wealthy, wanted to make sure he had enough money to support these 7 people in his church to pray for him. So they gave him land grants, but they also gave him this textile because they knew that this would be an object of pilgrimage. And as pilgrims would come to this church, they would leave money as they venerated this textile. Fine. Everything was good up until that point, except for one big problem. These 7 people in the church, once they got a hold of this textile, claimed not that it was a man-made object capturing an image of the dead Christ after the crucifixion, but that it was in fact the real shroud of Jesus. The real shroud of Jesus. And not only did they falsely claim that they had the real shroud when they knew they did not, they forged miracles. How do we know that? Because the bishop of the town 12 miles north, Troyes, the town of Troyes in France, beautiful town, it's where the Seine River begins. The bishop in Troyes is looking at what's going on in this little wooden church 12 miles south of town, and all kinds of people are coming there and leaving all kinds of donations on the altar, money, and thinking they're actually looking at the true shroud of Christ, and thinking they're actually seeing on that shroud the true image of Christ. And he knows it's a lie. How does he know it's a lie? because they actually found the artist who made it. And he's trying to stop it. But these 7 prelates won't stop. And by this time, the king is dead. First, he's far away fighting for the crown, and then he dies. So the bishop can't appeal to Geoffroy de Charnay, who is a truly honorable man, but is in contest, is in conflict with these priests that are working on the memory of his behalf, and he can't stop them. And he appeals to the Pope in Avignon, and the Pope says, don't do this. And then finally decides he's going to seize this textile because it's being misrepresented and people are being fooled out of their money. And so the prelates hide it away. 34 years go by. As I say, Geoffroy de Charnay is dead, but his widow is still living, and his son, Geoffroy de Charnay II, is still living, and all of a sudden they start to display it again. Now, they take care not to call it the Shroud of Jesus, but they do all kinds of verbal tricks to delude their visitors into thinking it is indeed the shroud. And by the way, over those 35 years, nobody forgot what had been claimed and the miracles that seemed to have happened in the 1350s. So now it's around 1390, and a new bishop is in conflict with new priests in that little church. And he goes to the Pope, and finally the Pope says, I've had enough. I'm going to issue a papal bull, and this is going to be the last word on this issue. Next image, please. So here he is, Anti-Pope Clement VII in Avignon in January of 1390. He gives instructions to this little bitty church in a town of 100 people that has been deluding their visitors for the last 35 years. And he says to the people that run that church, when you show this textile, I've got some news for you. You have to station a priest at the side of the stand where it's displayed. And the priest has to say in a loud and clear voice, without any hint of deception, the following. He says, the shroud is not the true shroud. This shroud is not the true shroud of our Lord Jesus Christ, but is a figure or representation of the shroud that is said to have been that of our Lord Jesus Christ. So you see what the Pope is saying. He's saying, in order that people not be deceived by what's going on here, you have to be very clear. And by the way, when you show it, you can't put candles or torches near it as you would a relic, because it's not a relic. It's a man-made object. And you have to be very clear with your visitor and tell them that this is a figure or representation of what is said to be the burial cloth of Jesus. So he doesn't even say there was such a thing as a burial cloth of Jesus. And even if there was, this is just a copy. It's a man-made thing. And you have to be very clear about that. Now, an interesting little point. You would think if these priests in this little wooden church in Neuilly knew that this was the real shroud of Jesus, if they actually believed that, they would have a story to explain how it happened to end up in their little church. After all, more than 13 centuries after the crucifixion. How, one might wonder, did this textile make its way to this teeny town in France? You would think they would tell people, and they didn't. Nobody had an explanation for how the shroud ended up there. Why? Because they all knew the truth, that it was recently man-made. Next image, please. So all of the evidence I've presented so far, history of relics, iconography, blood frenzy, Black Death, the historical record, in other words, the papal bull and the conflict between these bishops and these priests, everything comes to rest around 1350. Okay. In 1983, 3 little pieces of the shroud were snipped off the lower right-hand corner. And under the auspices of the British Museum, they were sent to 3 scientific laboratories, one in Tucson, Arizona, one in Geneva, Switzerland, and one in Oxford, England. And they were sent blind. In other words, they were sent with other linen fragments. And each lab was invited to carbon-14 date their samples. And only when they were correlated by the British Museum in October, or late summer actually, of 1988, did everybody know what the evidence indicated. And by the way, the evidence was focused on when the flax from which the linen was made was cut. The reason being, carbon-14 date works like this. A living organism over time builds up isotopes of carbon. And when that living organism dies, the isotopes decay over time. And the rate at which they decay, these isotopes, can be measured with surprising precision. And so the 3 labs converged exactly in the conclusion. The linen from which the Shroud of Turin was made was cut between 1260 and 1390. The midpoint between those 2 dates is 1325. And the 3 labs said, we are certain of this to 95% surety. 95% certain that the flax from which the linen was made of the Shroud of Turin was cut between 1260 and 1390. So again, if you drop the midpoint, 1325, it's within a generation of all the converging other evidence. So what did the church say in the fall of 1988? They said the Shroud of Turin isn't authentic. Next slide. Well, that wasn't the end of the story. One would have thought that was the end of the story, but there are any number of reasons that people who believe in the Shroud and that people who approach its story with a kind of science or historical bias or perspective, and they're called syndenologists. There are quite a few of them. They have their own website. Many books have been published by them. Syndenologists have been studying the Shroud for almost 100 years in different ways. And so they have thought of many different reasons why the carbon-14 dating was bad. Either people have touched it in that place, or at the most extreme, they swapped out in the labs pieces of linen that they knew to have been 14th century in order to discredit the Shroud and thereby discredit Christianity. So the Shroud is still an object of study, an object of veneration, and certainly an object of pilgrimage when it comes out every time. But what is the Shroud in the end? Because up to this point, all my evidence converges, but for the longest time, I couldn't figure out how it was made. It doesn't look like a work of art. It doesn't look like any work of art. And in fact, what it looks like is a kind of photograph, almost like a photograph. And that's why it appears with such clarity in a negative. In fact, when the Shroud of Turin was first photographed in 1898 by an Italian amateur photographer named Secondo Pia, he looked at his glass plate. They were made of glass in those days. And he looked at it, and it was so much clearer than the sepia faint little rusty images on the textile itself. It was all of a sudden very clear. So he came to the conclusion, and that conclusion has sort of taken root, is that the Shroud is a photograph-like image 2,000 years before the invention of photography. Well, it is like a photograph, I finally figured out, and it only is common sense in a way. It's a body contact image. It is a contact print of a real human being, almost as if you put your hand on a Xerox machine and then see what comes out. It's not a photograph, but it's like a photograph. And it became very clear to me when the movie The Passion of the Christ came out in 2004. that Jim Caviezel, who played Christ in The Passion of the Christ, was made up to look like Christ. He's an actor who, in normal street clothes and without the contact lenses that made his eyes brown, they're blue in fact, looks like, Jim Caviezel. But when he's made up and bloodied up and wears long hair or wig, beard and mustache, as Jesus was understood to look like, then he is a different person. And it just seemed obvious to me at a certain point that what we see on the Shroud of Turin is in fact a body part of a real human being that someone then came along and touched up, made up with vermilion. And in fact, there are two kinds of chemicals on the surface of the linen, both of which are iron-based. And one is the faint back image, and the other one is a more reddish vermilion-like image. And the vermilion-like image are the blood images on the feet, the side, the palm of the hands, and these dozens and dozens of what seem like flagellation wounds. So, most simply stated, the shroud is a human body print made up. If Jim Caviezel is captured on film, this made-up body was captured on linen. Next one. But I didn't know how this could ever have come about. And the oddest thing happened. And without this, I would never have written the book. For 10 years, the Walters Art Museum, when I was director, had a very unusual medieval manuscript, which was quite famous for those people who care about the history of science. And it's called the Archimedes palimpsest. Archimedes is the famous Greek mathematician, scientist who died in the 3rd century BC in Sicily. And he thought in a way that Newton thought. He was among the most brilliant thinkers of all time. He thought he invented the notion of infinity, for example. And so anything that preserves his intellect, his writing, is precious. In 1998, a manuscript was sold at Christie's in New York City that contained his writings. And this was a big deal. It sold for $2 million. And it was bought by a tech billionaire. And he wanted it studied. And we were lucky enough at the Walters to strike a deal with him, and we had it for 10 years and studied it. The reason it was so difficult to study this manuscript of Archimedes was the original text was written in the 10th century in Constantinople, and whoever wrote it was looking at something much earlier. But because it was a secular text and a non-Christian text, and because vellum, animal skin, is very expensive, a couple hundred years later, somebody wanted to use this vellum to do a Christian book. So they scraped away the Archimedes, literally, with pumice, with a volcanic rock. They scraped away the text that was already there, cut the book in half, re-sewed it, and put a Christian text on top. So the difficult thing, and the reason it took so long to read this text, was you had to be able to read the very faint remainder of the undertext. And by the way, in Greek, palimpsest means written again or written over, as in palindrome, to run again. And reading that required a lot of fancy scientific equipment, including a cyclotron. And so it attracted some of the most brilliant minds across the globe who cared about the history of science and just wanted to tackle the puzzle of recapturing what Archimedes had to say about science. And one of the most interesting among them was a guy who lives on his own little reserve, so to speak, in northeast Oklahoma. His name is Bob Morton. He's a chemist, and his career was with Phillips Petroleum. He was hired directly out of college by them. He had a PhD, got a very young age. He claims, and I think everybody believes him, that his IQ is more or less unmeasurable. And he was given a job by Phillips Petroleum in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, in the office at the end of the hall, to tackle hard problems. Nobody reported to him. He reported to nobody. His job was simply to find hard problems and solve them, like how to get sulfur out of oil. But he had plenty of time on his hands. So he was the guy that figured out that dinosaurs had feathers. He was the guy to reconstruct the soft body parts of trilobites. How did he do it? With X-ray fluorescence. In other words, he cared not about what something looked like, but on trace chemical analysis through X-rays. So he came to the Walters and he said, you know, we can read that undertext not by special lighting and special photography, but by bombarding the manuscript with X-rays and reading for iron content, because he knew that medieval ink was made of iron and sulfur, and that the two writings, one underneath the other, were almost certainly slightly different in their iron composition. And sure enough, he was right. You were able to read the text no matter what was on top of it. It was very expensive. It took a lot of time, but the owner had plenty of money, and so we did it. And so Bob Morton, this brilliant guy who just solves problems because he's interested in problems, was watching television with his daughter, and he was watching a show on the Shroud of Turin and the Shroud of Turin mystery, how it was made. Nobody could figure out how this image came to be. And Bob said, you know, that very faint sepia image on the shroud looks a lot like that very faint ink on the Archimedes palimpsest. And he said, I bet that image was made with the ingredients of medieval ink. There are only two basic ingredients: iron sulfate, in other words, a ferrous element, and tannic acid. And when the two are separated, one is a kind of milky green and one is a kind of a pale translucent brown. The tannic acid is sort of like tea, strong tea. And when they're separated, that's what they look like. But when they're put together, they turn instantly deep black. And the iron sulfate will gradually oxidize, will gradually rust, will gradually turn to a pale sepia color over time, unless the third ingredient is added to the ink, and that's tree sap. And the tree sap will seal the ink and keep it black. But because the Archimedes have been scraped, the tree sap came off. And that's why the undertext looked exactly like the Shroud of Turin, a very faint sepia color. Why? Because it's oxidized ferrous sulfate. It's rust. Next one. So Bob went from the theoretical insight as he was watching that television show on the Shroud of Turin, and I have to think that Leonard Nimoy was probably the host, to doing experiments, and that's his wife there in the image on the left. And it was pretty simple. At first, it was very simple. He just boiled some tea. As you can see, the tea rag is what he's holding over his wife's face. And then he lathered up his wife's face with iron sulfate. And by the way, it's the kind of stuff that that's easy to make because you can just put nails in water for a while. And he put the two together. And sure enough, two things happened. His wife's face turned black, and the textile bore an image of his wife's face. So he realized that wasn't such a good idea because it took a long time for, you know, the stain because it's indelible to come off. But he did some modifications. He put honey in the liquid to make it smoother, and then he had an intermediary textile. So he would develop the intermediary textile so that the body part that was the model would not itself turn black. And he got very good at it. And he made lots of shrouds. And next image. And what he found was he could get a just amazingly precise print of a human face. And by the way, you could keep building up an image. You didn't have to do it all at once. All you had to do was lather up part of the body, print it, then rinse the textile, rinse the linen. And if you were in register, much like a lithograph, you could add pieces. And what he found is to get the face just right, it took 7 passes. If you didn't do the eyes separately, they were too far apart and looked strange. And you couldn't wrap the textile around the face because it looked like a squished orange. And you had to do the brow separately to make it look right. But he figured this out over a couple of weeks. He was able to through multiple copies, get the image just right. And by the way, while I didn't take note of it as we went through, the arms of the man on the Shroud of Turin are much too long. And for one good reason, they have to cover his genitals. And the arms are too long because they can be too long. In printing the image of the body, they just added another length of arm. And so that's why the image is both very real on the one hand, seemingly more real than a photograph can be real, and yet not real because it's distorted in the multiple copies in order to create an image that actually preserved the modesty of Christ. So immensely accurate in its detail if you look at the negative version on the right. And what happens to that image, as you see it there, it's a kind of a steel gray over a pale linen. Over time, over a matter of a couple of years, that steel gray will oxidize, since it's not sealed, there is no tree sap to seal it, will oxidize gradually to a pale sepia color, very close to the shroud. Next image. So this is my last image, and I pose a final question. Remember that the shroud was given to the knight Geoffroy de Charnay by somebody, certainly somebody important, certainly somebody who wanted him to have an attraction for his little church so that he could get some money for the prelates that ran it. He had 2 close friends who cared about him in 1355. One was Clement VI, who the papacy was then in Avignon in southern France, and he was the one that built the papal palace, which people visit. And he cared a lot about Geoffroy de Charnay, and he also had Italians working for him, artists, working for him in his palace. So he could have asked one of these artists to fiddle around and see if they could make a body print. And the artists, who must have been, whoever he was, a Leonardo-like figure to combine chemistry and artistry so brilliantly, so cleverly. Or it could have been King John II, John the Good of France, who you see at the right, lower right-hand corner. John was very close, as I said already, to Geoffroy the Knight. In fact, Geoffroy de Charnay had saved his life after he had given them the shroud. He had asked Geoffroy to write the book of chivalry so knights would know proper behavior. He'd given Geoffroy de Charnay his royal standard, the Oriflamme, which meant to say that he was the lead figure beside the king as they entered battle. So there was nobody. And by the way, the king also sent him on diplomatic missions. He acted diplomatically in the voice of the king. So the king was very close. The king's artist is the artist who painted the king himself, the image at the lower right-hand corner. This is a unique image of a royal figure in the medieval period. Nobody knows who this artist is. No other artist was so nearly accurate in detail, physically, as they painted in the Middle Ages as this man. It is the first painting you see in the medieval galleries in the Louvre, and it is absolutely one of a kind. And nobody knows who this artist was. In the end, I think it was John II who employed this very artist to create the Shroud of Turin for his friend Geoffroy de Charnay. Next image. And I even suspect that John II was the model. And I say this because of reverse engineering. What you see above is Jeff Johnson, You've already seen his contact body image, and that's Jeff himself. So as you can walk back out of Jeff's shroud face to Jeff's real face, you can walk back out of the man on the shroud at the lower left to the person whose face is printed on the shroud. And what is most striking, and by the way, the artist would certainly have chosen somebody with long hair, mustache, and a beard. Much as I asked Bob Morton to make a face shroud of somebody, Jeff Johnson in this case, with long hair, mustache, and a beard. But what's so striking about John II and what's so striking about the man in the shroud is the nose. And much as the Habsburgs had a Habsburg jaw, the Valois, the dynasty to which John II belonged, his father, Charles V, his son, Charles VI, John II, they all had enormous noses. So as you look at the images below, you can see a remarkable forensic match between the king himself and the face on the shroud. So my contention, and it can never be proved, I'm quite comfortable. I would bet anything that the shroud was made in the early 1350s. I would bet anything it was made in Paris. I'm absolutely certain it was gifted by King John II to Geoffrey de Charnay. No doubt about any of that. Speculation that the king himself was the model. Speculation that the king gifted not only an object to that little church that he knew would be a revenue stream, he also gifted to his best friend his own portrait. And that is my last slide, and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. That was very informative. We do have a few questions that have come through. One that you just kind of touched on, and noted. So I do want to make sure that this individual knows we did ask the question. They did ask the name of the artist who created the shroud, and from what I'm understanding from you, we don't really have a solid answer on who that might be.
No, we have no answer at all. And in a way, it's not too surprising because unlike the Italians of the 14th century, who were artists who had names, who actually had personalities, the artists of France were still anonymous. And so we don't know who this person is. We know that he is brilliant, that he took a path that nobody else had taken in terms of reality in that profile portrait. And we know that he worked for the king. And that's about it.
Okay, so we're going to backtrack a little bit through some of your presentation, and a question came in about what were some of the false miracles that were attributed to the Holy Shroud? Do you have any that you can share?
Well, they don't show exactly what they were, but there is another text that does describe what they are, and they're almost comical. People would take their leg and wrap it up, at the knee level, and then wear a crutch so that it looked like they only had half a leg. And then they would have some gyration or some moment that a miracle would take place. Their leg would drop down as if restored. They'd throw the crutch away and walk away. Another one was it's a little trick that my father used to pull on me, where you look like you're making your thumb come out like this. They would wrap their fingers in the palm of their hand as if the fingers had been cut off. And the fingers were restored. So these weren't miracles that were kind of potentially psychosomatic, namely, I have a stomach ache or I have a headache and now I don't. I mean, anybody could say that. These were miracles that are actually physically demonstrable. And so that's what they did.
Well, to me, my background's in public relations, so to me, it sounds like the great start of some supreme marketing to get people to come and see that Holy Shroud. We do have
There's another trick they had. The first time it was shown in the 1350s before they hid it away for 34 years. They were calling it the Sudarium Christi. And technically that means the shroud of Christ. Anybody who hears those two Latin words, Sudarium Christi, knows that that means the shroud of Christ. So when they came back with it, they knew that the Pope was angry at them. They knew the bishop was very angry at them. So they weren't going to look for trouble by saying, this is Sudarium Christi. But as they would talk at the front of the church in muffled voices, they would use the word sanctuarium. Now, sanctuarium simply means church, sanctuary. But, and this is in the text, the bishop says, you people are terrible. He says, you're using the word sanctuary and you're mumbling it because you know that simple people at the back of the church, at the front door, actually, 45 feet away, will hear sanctuarium and they'll think they've heard sudarium. It was an acoustical trick they were using. So it was clearly duplicitous, conniving, deceitful. And it was driven by money. And by the way, John II certainly knew that you didn't have to lie about this image for people to want to come and see it. It could be a very attractive devotional image, understood for actually what it was and what the Pope said it was, namely a figure representation. People could use that as people now use icons or sacred images all over Christianity as a vehicle for veneration without misunderstanding it as a relic. And by the way, the Pope, Francis, Benedict, were scrupulous in avoiding the word relic because they know it never touched the body of Jesus. So the official Catholic position to this day is the same position that was taken in 1390, namely this is a figure or representation. It is not a relic and should not be treated or understood as a relic. So I have no disagreements with the Catholic Church, except to say that I would like to think that in 2025, they would do what they were told to do in 1390, and that is to station somebody next to the image and say, in a loud and clear voice, this is not the burial shroud of Jesus, but rather a figure representation of what is said by some to be the burial shroud of Jesus. Imagine what that would do.
Well, you did just answer a question that came through about what the Catholic Church's position today is. So thank you for that. And I will ask you one more question. I think we are getting we are a little over time, so I appreciate everyone hanging on a little longer. But just final question, does the shroud have artistic merit in your opinion?
Absolutely. It is a brilliant kind of intersection of chemistry, very subtle chemistry, and artistry. And when I say artistry, I think especially of the face. The face conforms exactly to what 14th century Christians believed Jesus looked like. So it didn't get that way by accident. Whoever did it had to be very careful that when somebody would come on this for the first time, they would look at it and say, this is Jesus because I know it looks like what Jesus looks like. So it's a brilliant piece of artistry and a brilliant piece of chemistry. And its closest comparisons are not paintings, but rather photographs. And of course, there are no photographs from the 14th century. So really, it's a kind of photography, and photographers make choices. And this person, who I'm sure passed this textile through dozen, perhaps 24 contacts with a body over a period of days, had to have a lot of practice because, and in fact, there is a practice image on the back. So that very piece of textile, and for a while I wondered, well, linen must be expensive. It wasn't. It's not as if he had so much trouble getting a nice big piece of linen to practice on. So yeah, he got very good at it. It's an extraordinary achievement. Brilliant.
Well, thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciate the time and leading us through this discussion. I hope everyone enjoyed this session and are leaving with new
Thank you.
perspectives. Thank you. And ideas about what the Holy Shroud, how it came to be, and what it means today. We hope you can join us for some of our other upcoming events. On November 10th, we are co-hosting a talk on the history of Veterans Day with veteran Rex Rayfeld. Our TU archivist Felicity Knox will be joining Rex to share the impact service members and veterans had and have on TU's campus. Then on November 18th, we will be hosting a virtual wine tasting with alumnus Bert Bossignani and his wife Lynn of Bossignani Winery in Sparks, Maryland. You can register and learn more about these events at alumni.towson.edu/events. I'd like to thank the TU Retired Faculty Association and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for their support of this discussion. Make sure you follow the TU Alumni Association on our social media channels and on Tiger Connect, our alumni community. These details are posted in your window now. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you the next time.